Hello, welcome. So, Canada, it's a country, and with it being a country, that means that it has a government to govern how the country is going to function. And the Canadian government is split into three different levels. That is the federal, provincial, and municipal. Municipal is like cities like Edmonton or towns like Westlock. Provincial would be the province of Alberta for any Americans watching. This is basically our version of a state. And then federal is the whole giant country, including everything up here, even though like 3 people live up here. So those are the levels of government. Today we're going to be specifically looking at federal, as that is the level of government that applies to the most people and is probably the most helpful for anyone who perhaps isn't Canadian and somehow stumbled across this video. These levels of government are put in place by a constitution. Basically, what a constitution is it's a legal document that exists within the country, and basically it's just a few sheets of paper, and it says, cool, this is how you're going to run your country now. Have fun. It's a very, very important piece of legislation, and every country that exists has a constitution that outlines how the country is to function. And within the Canadian Constitution, it splits the powers of the government into 3 specific branches. So ultimately, Canada does still recognize the British monarchy as the head of state, state being country, more or less interchangeable. Perhaps I'll get into the differences at another point. So those 3 branches of government are the executive branch, which would be the Prime Minister, and the Governor General. The Governor General is the Canadian Parliament member who represents the Crown. And then you've got the legislative branch, which we will be looking at today. I'm looking at the executive in the next video, and the judiciary, which is off here to the side. That will be the video after that. In the legislative branch, it is the Senate and the House of Commons. Senate is exactly the same for any Americans watching as the American Senate, but slightly different that I will go over. And the House of Commons is basically our version of Congress. And then, as I said, judiciary is over here. That's your Supreme Court, just all judges and courts. And I will be going into these 2 today. Next, I'm going on to the Senate. The Senate, it's made up of 105 members that are appointed by the then sitting Prime Minister and approved by the Governor General, and they hold their seats until age 75. In the United States, I don't want to suggest an edit, no. I believe it's every 5 years in the States, whereas in Canada, it's pretty much for life. So you could get elected at 31 and then be in office for 44 years as a senator. The Senate holds a lot of power, and that's a topic in Canadian politics that people often discuss because people question whether or not someone who has the power that a senator has, possibly 40 years of say over the laws that get passed in Canada, is that something that should be voted on or something that should be appointed? That is very much so a big topic in Canadian politics. Then the role of the Senate is basically very similar to the United States. A bill is proposed. It could be proposed in either the Senate or the House of Commons / Congress. It has to make it through the House of Commons, through the Senate, and then it goes to receive royal ascension, which I will talk about the other half of the process, the executive side of the process, in the next video, because there's just way too much to these branches to cover everything in just one video and keep it somewhat timely. Basically, a bill is introduced. A bill is just a new law or a new idea that the country wants implemented into the law. It usually passes through the House first, then it comes to the Senate. The Senate read over the bill. They see if it makes sense to them. They find any legal loopholes that might exist and rewrite it if necessary. If that happens, if any revisions happen while in the Senate, it can then pass through the Senate, and then it has to go through the House again, where they will now look at the revisions and have to look at it that way. Something interesting about the Senate that happened somewhat recently, as of 2016, is that originally the Senate was made up of people who were not bipartisan. They were very much partisan. They were tied to a political party. That's what partisan means. But in 2016, Justin Trudeau, following his 2015 election, Trudeau, the current prime minister, decided to make the Liberal senators independent. So they did not have any actual ties to the Liberal Party, other than they probably still share similar ideas, but there is no actual connection anymore. As you can see, if we go through the list of senators, and there's a few, 105, you have PSG, that is Progressive Senate Group, you have ISG, that is Independent Senate Group, you have C, which is just Conservative, because the Conservative senators still have a tie to their political party, and then you also have CSG, which is the Canadian Senate Group. As this article is saying, 80% of the Senate is now independent, meaning that they don't have any ties to parties, like, legally. But there is still that argument to be made that even though they're independent, they still probably have very similar ideals and ideas to whichever political party they came from. And so, yeah, that's the senators. And so that's the Senate. It works pretty similar to the states, to my knowledge. I'll go more in depth when I do the American political system eventually. And then we get to the House of Commons. So currently there are 333 members currently in the House, but that number is actually going up because the population rose, and how it works is very similar to the states, is that each province has ridings within that province. And just like in the states, it's first past the post voting system, which I will cover in another video. But basically, people run representing the parties in these ridings. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. So, like, we got riding 9 here. Or is that an 8? I think that's an 8. It's an 8. So we got riding 8 here. So someone from each of the major parties, at least, ran in this riding, and then a vote was held, and the Liberal member got the most votes, so they won the riding, which then gives them a seat in the House. And as the population goes up, so does the requirements for ridings, because I don't know what the math is exactly, but it's X amount of people equals a riding. If the population goes up, then you have more than X amount of people, so a new riding needs to be created. So it will be going up to 343 starting in the next election. Come the next election, there will be the new ridings put in place. And then, if you win your riding, then you receive a seat in the House of Commons, and basically how it works is just whoever wins the most seats in the House of Commons, whoever holds the most seats, that is the government in charge. So as you can see, the Liberals take up all this red space here. The Conservatives are all that blue space. So this is a minority government because the Liberals do not have more than 50%. So they can't just inherently force through bills, because I will get into this in the next video in the executive branch. The Prime Minister does have some ways of making his members agree with him and be like, cool, I want this bill to go through. So do you. And so then the bill goes through if they were to have 51% of the House, but they do not. So it is a minority government, in theory, promoting, not necessarily camaraderie, what's the word for it? Promoting collaboration, that's it, between the political parties, because for anything to get through, at least 2 parties have to vote on it. So you've got the Liberals in red, Conservatives in dark blue, Bloc de Québécois in light blue, and the NDP are orange. Then you got the Green Party and 3 independent people. And yeah, so that's the makeup of the House. The House works very similar to the Senate, where members of the House will introduce a bill that they think is good and important and they want introduced to the Canadian legal system. It will be proposed. It will be looked over by everyone in the House. All members, in theory, read it, have their opinions on it, change it so that it best represents and works for their riding. In theory, that's how it's supposed to work. And then discuss it, rewrite it if necessary, make revisions, and then if it passes through the House, then it goes to the Senate. If it passes through the Senate, well, then it's up to getting royal ascension, which I will go over in the next video. How this process happens, how it starts, is a member puts in a notice and placement of the order paper. That's basically just, the order paper is just like, hey, I would like to propose this bill because I think it's kind of cool. So then they give that to the office clerk, and the office clerk goes through his list of like, cool, so here are the bills like that people want to bring up. And then he brings them to the House. The House talks about it, debates it. You got some political banter back and forth because it is still based off of the British parliamentary system. So is a very ruckus time. Raucous? It's very rowdy in the House of Commons. There's lots of bickering, lots of yelling, lots of like booing and clapping and all that sort of stuff. It's arguably entertaining if you like politics at all. And so, yeah, and this is ultimately what it looks like. Liberals on this side, conservatives on this side. The Speaker of the House there, and as I said, it's very rowdy in the House. The Speaker is the guy that's like, okay, can we please stop name calling? John, that was rude. Please apologize. And that's off topic. Please stay on topic. That's more or less his job. And also, which happens fairly commonly to my knowledge, just being like, okay, everyone, we need to calm down. It's getting a little loud in here. So yeah, that's his job. And that's the legislative branch of Canada. I will be covering the executive in the next video. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.